I want to bring in CBS News special correspondent Norah O'Donnell, who's in our Washington bureau. Norah, we've watched you covering the Pope. We know you sat down with him last year for a really insightful one-on-one conversation. We're all still absorbing the shock of this. We saw Pope Francis on Sunday. First, give us your reaction to seeing this news today, just after Easter Sunday, where Pope Francis was on the balcony there.
Well, I think the world and the more than 1 billion Catholics are waking up on this Easter Monday mourning the passing of Pope Francis, a man who was known as the People's Pope, who led the Catholic Church for more than a decade, and as you noted, has battled health issues, is one of the oldest popes ever. Serving until the age of 88, until he passed just this morning in Casa Santa Marta, the guest house where he lives, that modest place, rather than in the luxurious papal apartments. And I think for many, especially the Catholics and pilgrims who were in Vatican City yesterday, there in St. Peter's Square, that got a glimpse of Pope Francis, it must be a very emotional moment to have been able to hear from the Pope on his final day, to see him in that Pope-mobile where he greeted people, even was able to see some babies, as traditional that the Pope will do and greet them. But I think it must have been a very moving moment yesterday, and then this morning to think that he has passed. I think in reflecting on his life and his legacy personally, as someone who grew up Catholic, it's remarkable that it was almost just a year ago that we sat down with Pope Francis for that groundbreaking and historic interview. Popes just don't give interviews. And the fact that we got about an hour with him to talk about any subject that we were able to talk about in that hour, and we tried to hit just about all of them. We did. And so we talked to him about how he wanted to change the church. I think interesting, the first thing I might just point out is yesterday in his remarks, and just about every remark that he made as Pope, the Holy Father talked about peace. And since October 7th, he has talked about peace between Israel and Gaza. He did it again yesterday. He talked once again about peace in Ukraine. He mentioned a number of other global conflicts around the world, because the Holy Father has said war is an obscenity. So that's, I think, one interesting thing to note, because while sometimes we think of Pope Francis just as the leader of the Catholic Church, he is a world leader. And we will see at his funeral, which will be anywhere from 4 to 6 days from now, we don't have an exact date, you will see world leaders will show up, noting his significance around the world and the weight that he brings to many issues. He has weighed in on the issue of migration, particularly clashing not only with President Trump, but the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who was just there yesterday and had a brief meeting with Pope Francis. On the issue of migration, Pope Francis himself, his parents were Italian immigrants to Argentina. And so one of the first things he did as Pope was he visited the tiny island of Lampedusa, which I know you know is just right off Italy, where many of those African migrants have been trying to make their way to Europe and have died. And he talked there at Lampedusa about the plight of migrants. And that has also been a theme throughout his entire papacy, is to talk about those who are trying to flee and live a better life. Other topics that we talked about with him, too, include the issue of LGBTQ+, because on one of Pope Francis's first trips, when he was asked about gay rights, he said, and gay people, he said, "Who am I to judge?" in his words. And that immediately made headlines. And I think that was the beginning, too, as John Allen mentioned, he became a lightning rod for many conservatives within the Catholic Church. We asked him about women in the Catholic Church, because, of course, women are the backbone of the Catholic Church. Think about all the nuns who not only take care of all the poor and sick around the world, but lead all the Catholic schools that around the world. And I did ask Pope Francis, would he consider ever making women deacons or priests? He said no. Because that would change church doctrine. Many people had hoped that he would, but he has appointed two sisters to managerial or lead posts within the Vatican. That's a significant step forward. So in many of these ways, he has made changes to the Catholic Church, tried to make it more inclusive, to change the tune of the Catholic Church. And then I think his legacy will continue in all of the cardinals that he has put in place. You know, Arrol, we will see in a few weeks from now the conclave that will take place, this incredible gathering of about 138 cardinals, the College of Cardinals, who will elect the next pope, the next Bishop of Rome. And we should note that Pope Francis has chosen and personally selected 110 of those cardinals. So they were loyal to him. They are cardinals who embodied many of the teachings that Pope Francis has tried to put forward. And so that, I think, is what he hopes, too, will be in part his legacy. Arrol?
And Norah, we wonder how much of the changes that Pope Francis brought to the church, that the cardinals that he appointed will want to continue in whoever they choose to be the next pope. Really eye-opening, so much of what you were able to discuss with the Pope during your conversation last year. I know he also said the globalization of indifference is a very ugly disease to you. You mentioned his efforts as soon as he was named Pope to head to southern Italy and effectively welcome the migrants who are seeking better lives. And we can't avoid the fact that Vice President J.D. Vance had a one-on-one meeting with the Pope just on Sunday, and the relationship between the Pope and the Trump administration currently and the previous administration is also something I want to discuss with you, because there were some friction points between Pope Francis, his doctrine, what he was trying to teach, and what he saw coming out of the United States. Share some of that with us.
Arrol, I'm glad you brought that up. That's right. The Pope did talk about, in terms of migration, what he called the globalization of indifference. And in our interview, he said people just wash their hands of the plight of these people. And if you take a moment just to think about why many people leave their homes and travel these dangerous journeys to go somewhere else, I think that is what Pope Francis wanted to put focus on, the humanity, and to try and think deeply about what these migrants are facing, whether it is war at home, poverty, abuse. And he said they are trying to flee injustice. And that very issue, the issue of migration, is why there has been this flashpoint with the current administration here. It is one where he has recently tussled, if you will, with the vice president, where they have traded remarks back and forth. And while it's not known whether it came up in their very brief meeting yesterday, in a meeting before Sunday, the vice president met with essentially the number 2 at the Vatican, and that was discussed. There's some discussion that there was a sharp discussion that happened between the vice president and leaders at the Vatican on that very issue. And I think more will come of that. And now that this is such a huge issue, not only here in the United States, certainly in the last administration, it was an issue because there were a large number of migrants that came into the United States. It also became, as you know, a big issue during the presidential campaign. And now it is at the forefront of this current presidency. And so I think that will continue as part of the discussion as we look at the legacy of Pope Francis. Arrol?
And Norah, I'm wondering, from your perspective, having had this time with Pope Francis, being a Catholic yourself, how you think the Church in America will remember Pope Francis, considering his teachings and his friction with the Trump administration. What is the lasting imprint, in your view, of Pope Francis?
Well, Arrol, that's an excellent question. About 20% of Americans identify themselves as Catholic. There is a large following of the Catholic faith here in the United States, but that number is dwindling. And certainly the Catholic Church has been beset by a number of scandals, most particularly the child sex abuse scandal, which we have done a lot of reporting on here at CBS News. It's certainly been my discussion with a number of cardinals here in the United States, and it came up in our interview with Pope Francis, and that is one of the things that he made some changes on, and how the Church deals with the sex abuse scandal. So I think here in America, many people were very fond of Pope Francis as he tried to be more inclusive and tried to focus on the values of St. Francis of Assisi, who he took the name of as the first Jesuit pope. And you can see even in his humility, he wore just the white cassock. He did not wear the red robe that you traditionally might see some cardinals in. But really, the Catholic Church in some ways is looking to Asia and to Africa. And that's where most of the growth is in the Catholic Church. And certainly the Holy Father made visits to those parts of the world. And I think certainly in the days and weeks to come, as the focus shifts to who might next lead the Catholic Church and be the next pope after this conclave, there'll be a lot of discussion about potentially a pope from Asia or Africa, as that is where the Church is growing. Arrol.
And finally, Norah, before we have to let you go, there'll be so many folks at the network who will need your insight today. I'm just curious at the standout moment for you during your one-on-one conversation with the Pope. You know, most of us can only imagine what that interview experience is like. Perhaps there were some surprises. You know, he had a sense of humor. What was the standout moment for you?
Well, Arrol, thank you for asking. You know, I was there some 12 years ago when the conclave elected Jorge Bergoglio of Argentina to become the next pope, and when he chose the name Pope Francis. And since then, was writing him letters and everybody in the Vatican to try and get an interview with the Holy Father. So certainly to be able to sit down with him just about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. You know, I was, of course, and I've interviewed lots of presidents, as you know, and important people, but this one was very nerve-wracking to interview the Pope. But I found him incredibly warm and incredibly funny and gracious with his time. Then he was 87 years old and super smart. When I asked him about a lot of different questions, he was very wise in the way he answered them. And I think the standout moment for me, to be honest, was a question that I asked him about surrogacy. You know, largely, I think the issues of women and children are ones that he tried to bring attention to. And so I asked him about the issue of surrogacy because he and the Church have denounced surrogacy. And so I brought up to him that I know many women who have suffered cancer who would like to have a child. And why does the Church not allow surrogacy? And while he said that it is still not approved within the Catholic Church, he did say, I acknowledge how much this affects you. And so there is a warmth about him. And my sense is that if the Church could open up more and listen to the concerns of women and mothers and others, there might be just a ray of light in terms of changing things. And I think that Pope Francis has slowly, part of his legacy will be trying to do that slowly to try and change some of the teachings of the Church to make it more inclusive.
Remarkable. Yes, surrogacy is not often a topic that we discuss or think about, but certainly a one so close and important to so many people.
And common for many people, you know, common for many people who want a child. He said, well, there's also adoption for these women, and that is absolutely true, and many people do adopt children. But just as times change and there are medical advances, the Church has been asked to adopt as well. But I think, Arrol, you know, my take is that this is a papacy that has been marked by an extraordinary level of discussion on a number of issues. Climate change. I mean, this Pope talked about climate change. So many different issues that never came before the Catholic Church were front and center for this Jesuit Pope, who was certainly an academic in many ways as well. Arrol.
Well, Norah, great to chat with you and to learn for all the viewers out there that writing a letter works if there's someone you really want to interview.
That's right, Arrol. Thank you. That's exactly right.
Norah O'Donnell there in our Washington bureau. We appreciate you sharing with us your insight, Norah. Thank you so much.